I still remember the exact second my mother smiled at me, and I realized she was enjoying it. The music was loud, crystal glasses clinked, 200 guests stood and applauded as my parents renewed their vows, hands clasped like a fairy tale couple. Everyone saw love, everyone saw success, everyone saw perfection, except me. Because in that moment, standing alone under the chandelier light, I understood something that changed me forever. This humiliation was planned. They wanted me small, they wanted me silent, and they wanted an audience. I felt my throat close as my father leaned into the microphone, cleared his throat, and said my name, not lovingly, not proudly, amused. The crowd laughed before I even knew why. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives wearing a smile, wrapped in celebration, disguised as a joke. And that night, at their wedding anniversary, my own parents turned me into the punchline. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I didn't always know my parents were capable of this. For most of my life, I believed what everyone else believed, that they were good people, respected, admired, the kind of couple neighbors pointed to and said, that's what marriage should look like. And maybe that's why it hurt more. Because behind closed doors, I was never the success story. I was the inconvenience, the reminder of mistakes they didn't want to talk about, the child who didn't fit into the image they had spent decades polishing. Still, when the invitation arrived, gold embossed, formal, elegant, I told myself things were changing. 50 years of love, it read. My mother called me personally. Her voice was sweet, too sweet. You'll be there, right? It wouldn't feel complete without you. I wanted to believe her. I bought a dress I couldn't afford. I rehearsed smiles in the mirror. I even practiced small talk, what to say when relatives asked what I was doing with my life now, because some part of me still hoped that this night might finally be different. The venue was breathtaking, a luxury hall overlooking the city skyline, white roses everywhere, soft golden lights, a live string quartet playing romantic classics. My parents entered like royalty. People stood, phones came out, applause filled the room, and then the speeches began. Friends told stories, relatives praised their perfect family. Someone joked about how lucky my parents were to have raised such an independent child. I should have noticed how my mother avoided my eyes. I should have noticed how my father kept glancing in my direction. But I didn't, because when you love people, you don't expect them to hurt you on purpose. Then my father stood up again. I want to share something special tonight, he said, tapping the mic, a little family moment. The room quieted. My name left his mouth and something inside me dropped. He started with stories from my childhood, things I never agreed to share, moments I thought were private, failures, mistakes, struggles, each one framed as a joke, each one followed by laughter. My mother laughed the loudest. People turned to look at me, smiling, curious, entertained. I felt heat rise to my face, my hands trembled, my ears rang, and then came the line that broke me. Well, my father said, chuckling, at least one of our kids didn't turn out exactly as planned. The room exploded. Laughter, applause, someone even whistled. I stood there frozen, realizing the truth far too late. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't harmless. This was humiliation, carefully rehearsed and beautifully timed. I looked at my mother. She met my eyes, and she smiled, not apologetically, not nervously, proudly. That was the moment something inside me shifted, something quiet but dangerous. because humiliation does something strange to you when it comes from the people who were supposed to protect you. It doesn't just hurt, it rewrites you. Later that night, I locked myself in the bathroom, staring at my reflection under harsh white light, mascara smudged, hands shaking, chest tight. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something colder, something clear. I pulled out my phone, out of instinct more than intention, and scrolled. And that's when it hit me. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one. So many stories, so many people betrayed by the ones who raised them, parents who smiled in public and destroyed in private, families who protected their image at the cost of their own children. I wasn't alone, and suddenly I understood something my parents never considered. They thought this story ended with laughter. They thought I would swallow it. They were wrong. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that this night didn't break me. It activated me. I walked back into the hall with a calm face and a quiet mind. I hugged relatives. I smiled for photos. I congratulated my parents. And all the while, a single thought echoed in my head. You just made the biggest mistake of your lives. Because everything they valued, their reputation, their respect, their carefully curated image, was built on lies, and I was the only one who knew where all the bodies were buried. As the lights dimmed and the anniversary cake was rolled out, my mother leaned over and whispered, "You're being very mature about all this." I looked at her and smiled back. She had no idea what that smile meant. She had no idea that the story she thought she controlled was about to be rewritten, and it would start sooner than she ever expected. That was only the beginning. The worst part wasn't the laughter. It was what came after. When the music swelled again, when people returned to their drinks, when the night kept moving forward as if nothing irreversible had just happened. As if I hadn't been publicly reduced to a joke by the two people who brought me into this world. I watched my parents glide through the room, accepting congratulations, soaking in admiration. My father's hand rested proudly on my mother's back. She leaned into him, glowing. They looked victorious, and I realized something terrifying. They felt justified. To them, my humiliation wasn't cruelty, it was entertainment, it was control. And control was something they had always needed over me. Growing up, love in our house had conditions. Praise came only when I reflected well on them. Silence followed whenever I didn't. My achievements were shared, my failures were mine alone. They loved to tell people how strong I was, how independent, how I didn't need much. What they never said was why, because independence is easy to admire when it's born from neglect. That night, as guests danced and laughed, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching myself from a distance, smiling, nodding, playing the role they expected. Inside, something else was happening. I was replaying moments, conversations, decisions, patterns. I remembered every time my mother had joked about my struggles in front of friends, every time my father framed my pain as a lesson, a warning, a story to make himself look wise. This anniversary speech wasn't an exception, it was the culmination. I stepped outside onto the balcony for air. The city lights blurred in front of me. My phone buzzed, messages from relatives. "Don't take it so seriously. You know how your dad is. They didn't mean it like that." That's how betrayal survives, not just through cruelty, but through excuses. I typed nothing back, because explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you is pointless. Behind me, the balcony door opened. My mother. She joined me, resting her elbows on the railing like we were sharing a peaceful moment. "You disappeared," she said lightly. I needed air. She nodded, then smiled, that same smile, polished, controlled. "You know," she said, "people loved the speech. Your father was so funny." I said nothing. She turned toward me, voice dropping just enough to feel intimate. "You're too sensitive," she added. "You always have been." There it was, the final twist of the knife. Pain reframed as weakness, cruelty dismissed as humor, responsibility quietly shifted onto me. I looked at her, then not as my mother, but as a stranger, and for the first time I saw her clearly. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge that I might be hurt, because in her mind my feelings were irrelevant compared to their image. And suddenly I understood something I wished I'd realized years earlier. They didn't humiliate me because they hated me. They humiliated me because they didn't respect me. When we went back inside, the cake was being cut. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted for me to come closer. "Family photo." He said, "Smile." And I did. Because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who learn to smile through pain. Later that night, when the party finally began to wind down, my father pulled me aside. He placed a hand on my shoulder, heavy, possessive. "You took that well," he said. "I was worried you'd make a scene." I met his eyes. "I would never embarrass you," I replied calmly. He laughed. "Good. You know how important tonight was for us." For us. As if I wasn't standing there still burning from what they had done, as if my role in this family was simply to endure. I drove home alone. The city was quiet. Street lights passed like slow heartbeats. My phone lay face down on the passenger seat, buzzing occasionally with more messages. I didn't answer any of them, because something had settled in me during that drive, a stillness that wasn't peace, but resolution. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. At home, I sat in the dark and opened my laptop, not to vent, not to cry, to review. Emails, documents, old messages, things I had ignored for years because they made me uncomfortable, things I had brushed aside because they were my parents. Patterns emerged quickly. Financial decisions that didn't add up, stories they told publicly that didn't match reality, moments where blame was quietly shifted onto me to protect them. And then something else, something I hadn't been looking for but couldn't ignore once I saw it. Proof. Not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. The kind of proof that doesn't scream, it waits. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. This wasn't revenge, not yet. This was clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous than rage. Because rage wants to destroy, clarity wants to expose. I thought of the laughter at the party, the applause, the way my parents basked in admiration, confident that their version of the story was the only one that mattered. They believed I was harmless. They believed silence meant forgiveness. They believed I needed them more than they needed me. They were wrong about all of it. Before going to bed, I opened YouTube. I scrolled through my own channel, videos where I talked about healing, boundaries, surviving emotional neglect. Comments poured in from strangers who somehow understood me better than my own family ever had. One comment stopped me cold. Sometimes the people who humiliate you publicly are terrified of what you could say if you ever stopped protecting them. I read it 3 times. Then I closed my laptop, because in that moment I knew exactly what came next. Not immediately, not impulsively, but deliberately, step by step. I turned off the lights and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My parents were sleeping peacefully that night, surrounded by flowers, gifts, and praise. They had no idea that their anniversary, the night they thought they celebrated 50 years of love, as actually the night they lost control of the story. And soon, everyone else would hear the version they worked so hard to bury. What I found next would change everything. There's a strange freedom that comes when you stop trying to be understood by the people who benefit from misunderstanding you. That's where I was now. Not angry, not reckless, focused. I stopped looking at my parents as parents and started looking at them the way the world did, as respected figures with a spotless reputation and absolutely everything to lose. And that changed the game. I knew something crucial. If I confronted them directly, they would deny. If I accused them emotionally, they would discredit. If I rushed, they would destroy evidence and flip the narrative. So instead, I did nothing. And that terrified them more than any accusation ever could. The first sign came 3 days later. My mother showed up unannounced. Again. She stood in my doorway with homemade food, soft eyes, and a voice dripping with concern. "You've been quiet," she said. "We miss you." We. Always plural, always united, always strategic. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked through my home slowly, looking around as if she were searching for something, or confirming something. "You seem different," she said finally. I smiled. "Different how?" She hesitated. "Calmer." There it was. Because calm is dangerous when you're used to controlling chaos. She sat at my table and folded her hands. "You know," she began, "families go through phases, misunderstandings, but outsiders don't need to be involved." I didn't answer. Silence makes people talk. She leaned forward. "Your father and I worry about how things might look if stories get twisted." I met her eyes. "Twisted by who?" I asked gently. She blinked, and just like that, the mask slipped. Her voice hardened, just slightly. "You don't want people thinking badly of us," she said, "after everything we've done for you." There it was again. The debt, the unpayable emotional loan they'd been collecting interest on my entire life. I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. Relief washed over her face. She stood, hugged me tightly, and whispered, "Good, I knew you'd come around." When she left, I locked the door and added another note to my mental list. That night, I backed everything up. Multiple places, multiple formats, redundancy layered on redundancy, because I knew what was coming next. People like my parents don't panic immediately. They probe. The probing came in the form of concern from relatives. Calls, messages, invitations, all strangely coordinated. Everyone suddenly wanted to check in. Everyone suddenly wanted to remind me how much my parents loved me. That's when I understood the second rule of exposure. Before the truth comes out, the liars try to get ahead of it. A cousin messaged me late one night. "Hey, just between us, are you okay? Your parents seem stressed." I stared at the screen. Stressed. That meant they sensed a shift. I replied simply, "I'm great, just focusing on honesty these days." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No reply. The next day, something unexpected happened. A former family friend emailed me. We hadn't spoken in years. The subject line read, "I think you should know." My heart slowed. Not raced, slowed, because deep down I already knew what it would say. She wrote carefully, gently. She talked about things she'd witnessed years ago, moments that felt wrong, comments that never sat right with her, situations where she suspected the story wasn't what it seemed, but she stayed quiet because it wasn't her place. Until now, because watching my parents humiliate me publicly had shaken something loose in her. "Good people don't need to tear their own child down for applause," she wrote. I closed my eyes and exhaled. This wasn't just my truth anymore. It was a pattern others had seen too, and ignored. I didn't respond immediately. I let it sit, because timing matters, and soon it would be time. That weekend, my parents hosted a small family brunch. I was invited, strongly encouraged. I almost didn't go. Then I realized this was an opportunity. I arrived calm, smiling, polite. They watched me closely, every movement, every word, trying to read me, trying to predict me. They laughed loudly, told stories, played the role of loving parents, but beneath it all, there was tension. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what it was. At one point, my father raised his glass. "To family," he said, "and forgiveness." Eyes turned to me. I lifted my glass slowly. "To truth," I replied. The silence was immediate. Someone laughed awkwardly. My father's smile stiffened. My mother's hand tightened around her fork. They knew. They just didn't know how much I knew. Later, my father cornered me in the hallway. "You're being strange," he said quietly. "People are noticing." I shrugged. Maybe people are just paying attention. His jaw tightened. "Be careful," he warned. "You don't want to hurt yourself." I looked him dead in the eyes. I'm done protecting people who hurt me. For the first time, he had no response. That night, I made a decision. Not to destroy them, not to embarrass them, but to remove the mask they wore so comfortably. And once it came off, they wouldn't need me to ruin them. They would do it themselves. I drafted an outline. Not a rant, not an accusation. A story, structured, factual, calm, undeniable. Because emotion can be dismissed, but consistency cannot. I didn't publish it, not yet. First, I needed one more thing, confirmation, because the most powerful truth is the one multiple people can stand behind, and I knew exactly where to get it. As I closed my laptop, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "We need to talk, urgently." I stared at the screen and smiled, because urgency only appears when control is slipping, and theirs was fast. The next conversation would decide everything. There's a specific kind of fear that doesn't make your heart race. It slows you down. That's what I felt the next morning when I woke up, clear-headed, steady, almost disturbingly calm. No tears, no shaking hands, just a quiet certainty sitting heavy in my chest. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And I had seen enough to know the story my parents told the world was a carefully rehearsed lie. I made coffee and opened my laptop again, not out of obsession, out of responsibility, to myself. I started where I always avoided: old family emails, shared folders, financial records my father insisted on handling because he was better with numbers. Messages from my mother where concern always sounded suspiciously like control. At first, it looked ordinary. Then the cracks appeared. Small inconsistencies, dates that didn't align, transactions that didn't match the stories they proudly told at dinner parties about sacrifice and hard work. I followed one thread, then another, and suddenly I wasn't digging anymore. I was uncovering. I remembered how often my parents had reminded me of everything they'd done for me, how any request for boundaries was framed as betrayal, how my independence was celebrated publicly but punished privately. Now I understood why. Because my dependence had been convenient and my silence had been profitable. I found documents tied to my name, accounts I didn't fully understand when I was younger, decisions made on my behalf, papers signed in moments when I trusted them blindly because why wouldn't I? They were my parents. My stomach tightened as the picture came together. They hadn't just controlled the narrative of my life, they had used it. I pushed back from the desk and stood up, pacing the room. This wasn't about money. It was about power, about presenting themselves as selfless, devoted parents while quietly benefiting from my compliance. And suddenly the humiliation at their anniversary made sense in a way that chilled me. It wasn't just cruelty, it was insurance. If I looked unstable, if I looked unsuccessful, if I looked like the problem child, then no one would believe me if I ever spoke up. I thought back to my father's speech, the laughter, the way he framed my struggles as proof of their patience and generosity. That wasn't a joke. That was character assassination, and it had worked for years. My phone rang. My mother. I stared at the screen until it stopped. Then another call. And another. Finally, a text. "Are you okay? You seemed distant last night." I almost laughed, because distance was the first boundary I'd ever enforced, and they could feel it immediately. I didn't respond. Instead, I kept digging, because every new detail added weight to a truth I could no longer ignore. My parents didn't see me as their child. They saw me as an extension of their image, and anything that threatened that image, my voice, my autonomy, my truth, had to be minimized or mocked or destroyed. By the afternoon, I had a folder, neatly organized, time-stamped, quietly devastating. The kind of thing that doesn't explode, it waits. I closed the folder and sat back, staring at the wall. This wasn't revenge, this was reckoning, and reckonings don't care about family titles. That evening, my father showed up at my door unannounced. I watched him through the peephole before opening it. He looked relaxed, confident, unconcerned. That told me everything. "You left early," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Your mother was worried." I gestured toward the couch. He sat. "So," he continued casually, "about last night. You know it was all in good fun." I nodded slowly. "Of course." He smiled, relieved, then leaned forward. "But just so we're clear," he added, voice lowering, "some things are better kept private, family matters. You understand." There it was, the warning disguised as wisdom, the threat wrapped in concern. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who taught me right from wrong, who insisted on honesty, who spoke endlessly about integrity, and I wondered how long he had believed his own lies. "I understand," I said calmly. He relaxed immediately, stood up, patted my shoulder. "That's my good kid." The door closed behind him, and I locked it. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, but because I was calculating. I thought about timing, about credibility, about consequences, because telling the truth doesn't automatically make you safe, especially when the people you're exposing have spent decades being admired. I knew one thing for certain. If I spoke too soon, I'd be dismissed. If I spoke emotionally, I'd be labeled unstable. If I spoke without strategy, I'd lose. So I didn't speak. I prepared. Over the next few days, I played my role perfectly. I answered messages politely. I reassured relatives. I even thanked my parents publicly for a beautiful celebration. They believed they'd won. They believed the storm had passed. They didn't realize they were standing in the eye of it. One afternoon, a distant aunt called me. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "Your parents adore you, you know. They talk about you all the time." I smiled to myself. "I know," I replied. She hesitated. "Still, sometimes people tell stories to protect themselves." The line went quiet. I held my breath. Then she added softly, "Be careful who you protect." The call ended, and for the first time, I realized something important. Not everyone was fooled. They were just waiting for someone brave enough to confirm what they already suspected. That night, I opened my YouTube channel again. I didn't post anything. I didn't tease. I just changed one line in my bio. Truth has a way of resurfacing. Within minutes, comments appeared. People sensed it. They always do. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling once more. My parents thought humiliation had silenced me. What it actually did was strip away my fear of losing them. Because once you realize someone has never truly been on your side, you stop protecting them. And that's when the real danger begins. The next step would require precision. One wrong move could destroy me instead. But the path was clear now, and once I stepped on it, there would be no turning back. What I decided to do next would put everything and everyone at risk. I didn't respond to my mother's message right away. Urgency is a weapon. Silence is a shield. I let the phone sit on the table while I made tea, while I washed a cup I didn't need to wash, while I stared out the window and watched the afternoon pass like any other day. Because whatever she wanted to say it before I spoke to anyone else. That alone told me everything. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. We can talk tomorrow. 3 dots appeared instantly. Then, please, this is important. I smiled to myself. So is the truth, I thought. The next day, I met them at their house. Neutral ground had always favored them. Familiar walls, carefully curated photos, awards on shelves, smiling family portraits frozen in time, proof of a story they desperately wanted preserved. I arrived on time. They were already seated, waiting. My mother started first. "We're worried about you," she said, hands folded tightly in her lap. My father nodded in agreement. "You've been distant, cold." I sat across from them, relaxed. "I've been honest," I said. The word landed heavily in the room. My father sighed, rubbing his temples as if burdened by my behavior. "Honesty is good," he said slowly, "but timing matters, and context." I raised an eyebrow. "Context like a wedding anniversary?" My mother flinched. There it was. "That was not meant to hurt you," she said quickly. "You're focusing on the wrong thing." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me," I said calmly, "what was the right thing to focus on while you laughed at me in front of 200 people?" Silence. Thick, uncomfortable. My father straightened in his chair. "You're exaggerating," he said. "You've always had a flair for drama." I nodded. Of course. Gaslighting, their favorite language. I took a breath. "I want to be very clear," I said. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to understand something." They exchanged a glance. "What?" my mother asked cautiously. "Why," I continued, "was it so important to make me look small?" My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father answered. "We were telling a story. People expect humor, warmth, family anecdotes." "At my expense?" I asked. He shrugged. "You're strong. You can handle it." There it was again, strength as justification for cruelty. I leaned back in my chair. "And what about everything else?" I asked. They both stiffened. "What else?" my mother said. I tilted my head slightly. "The accounts, the decisions, the things done in my name." The room went very quiet. My father laughed softly. "You've been digging." Not a question. "Why wouldn't I?" I replied. My mother's voice sharpened. "You're misunderstanding things. Those were for your benefit." "Were they?" I asked, "because the records say otherwise." Her face drained of color. Just slightly, but enough. My father stood up. "You don't know what you're talking about, and even if you think you do, no one will believe you." Ah, there it was, the truth beneath everything. I looked up at him, calm as ever. "You're right," I said. "If it were just me, they wouldn't." He froze. My mother's eyes flicked between us. "What does that mean?" she asked. I stood as well. "It means," I said evenly, "that I'm not the only one who noticed." I watched the realization spread slowly across their faces. Fear, not explosive, not dramatic, but controlled panic, the kind that comes when you realize the script has changed and you don't know your lines anymore. My mother stood abruptly. "You wouldn't do this to us," she said. I met her gaze. "You already did it to yourselves," I replied. "I just stopped covering for you." My father stepped closer. "This will destroy the family," he said quietly. "People will talk. Reputations will be ruined." I didn't flinch. "You taught me honesty mattered more than comfort. I finally believed you." For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother's voice broke. "What do you want?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Power shifted in that instant. I shook my head. "That's the thing," I said. "This isn't a negotiation." I picked up my bag. "I'm not threatening you. I'm not asking for apologies. I'm not demanding explanations." I walked toward the door. "I'm telling my story." My father followed me. "You think you'll come out of this clean? You think people won't judge you?" I turned back. "I already lived with your judgment. Strangers don't scare me." I left without another word. The door closed behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. That night, my phone exploded. Calls, messages, missed calls from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Relatives, friends, people suddenly very invested in my silence. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and began preparing the first release. Not everything, just enough. I scheduled nothing publicly, but privately I reached out to 3 people, carefully, respectfully. Each one responded the same way. "I've been waiting for this." As midnight approached, I sat back in my chair. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't shaking. I felt something else entirely, certainty. I didn't respond to my mother's message right away. Urgency is a weapon. Silence is a shield. I let the phone sit on the table while I made tea, while I washed a cup I didn't need to wash, while I stared out the window and watched the afternoon pass like any other day. Because whatever she wanted to say, she wanted to say it before I spoke to anyone else. That alone told me everything. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. "We can talk tomorrow." 3 dots appeared instantly. Then, "Please, this is important." I smiled to myself. So is the truth, I thought. The next day, I met them at their house. Neutral ground had always favored them. Familiar walls, carefully curated photos, awards on shelves, smiling family portraits frozen in time, proof of a story they desperately wanted preserved. I arrived on time. They were already seated, waiting. My mother started first. "We're worried about you," she said, hands folded tightly in her lap. My father nodded in agreement. "You've been distant, cold." I sat across from them, relaxed. "I've been honest," I said. The word landed heavily in the room. My father sighed, rubbing his temples as if burdened by my behavior. "Honesty is good," he said slowly, "but timing matters, and context." I raised an eyebrow. "Context like a wedding anniversary?" My mother flinched. There it was. "That was not meant to hurt you," she said quickly. "You're focusing on the wrong thing." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me," I said calmly, "what was the right thing to focus on while you laughed at me in front of 200 people?" Silence. Thick, uncomfortable. My father straightened in his chair. "You're exaggerating," he said. "You've always had a flair for drama." I nodded. "Of course. Gaslighting, their favorite language." I took a breath. "I want to be very clear," I said. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to understand something." They exchanged a glance. "What?" my mother asked cautiously. "Why," I continued, "was it so important to make me look small?" My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. My father answered, "We were telling a story. People expect humor, warmth, family anecdotes." "At my expense?" I asked. He shrugged. "You're strong. You can handle it." There it was again, strength as justification for cruelty. I leaned back in my chair. "And what about everything else?" I asked. They both stiffened. "What else?" my mother said. I tilted my head slightly. "The accounts, the decisions, the things done in my name." The room went very quiet. My father laughed softly. "You've been digging." Not a question. "Why wouldn't I?" I replied. My mother's voice sharpened. "You're misunderstanding things. Those were for your benefit." "Were they?" I asked, "because the records say otherwise." Her face drained of color. "Just slightly, but enough." My father stood up. "You don't know what you're talking about, and even if you think you do, no one will believe you." Ah, there it was, the truth beneath everything. I looked up at him, calm as ever. "You're right," I said. "If it were just me, they wouldn't." He froze. My mother's eyes flicked between us. "What does that mean?" she asked. I stood as well. "It means," I said evenly, "that I'm not the only one who noticed." I watched the realization spread slowly across their faces. Fear, not explosive, not dramatic, but controlled panic, the kind that comes when you realize the script has changed and you don't know your lines anymore. My mother stood abruptly. "You wouldn't do this to us," she said. I met her gaze. "You already did it to yourselves," I replied. "I just stopped There's a point of no return when you tell the truth. Not when people start listening, not when the guilty panic, but when silence becomes impossible. That moment arrived 3 days later. I hadn't slept much, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was sharp, alert, tracking everything. Messages I didn't answer, articles that mentioned my parents without naming them, conversations that suddenly stopped mid-sentence when I walked into rooms. The world hadn't exploded, it had shifted, and my parents were trapped in the middle of it. They tried one last tactic, unity, a joint statement, carefully worded, vague, polite. They posted it early in the morning, hoping to get ahead of the day's cycle. "We are saddened by recent misunderstandings shared publicly. Our family matters are complex and deeply personal. We ask for privacy as we work through this privately, with love." No denial, no apology, just enough ambiguity to plant doubt. For a brief moment, it almost worked. Then people started asking questions, not emotional questions, specific ones. Which parts are misunderstandings? What exactly is being worked through? Why hasn't anything been addressed directly? And most importantly, why does this pattern keep appearing? Because by then, others had started speaking too, quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. I watched the comment sections evolve in real time. The tone changed, not angry, analytical. People weren't reacting anymore. They were connecting dots. That's when I knew it was time. I opened the folder I'd been avoiding, the one labeled simply Timeline. Inside were documents, confirmations, messages, everything that transformed a personal story into a verifiable pattern. I didn't dump it all. I curated. Because power doesn't come from volume, it comes from clarity. Before publishing anything, I did something unexpected. I recorded a short video. No edits, no background music, just me. Calm, grounded, unflinching. I looked straight into the camera and I said, "I didn't want to do this, but silence is being used as a shield. So today I'm sharing receipts, not to punish, but to protect the truth." That was it. I hit upload. The response was immediate and brutal, not toward me, toward the illusion my parents had spent decades maintaining. People didn't cheer, they withdrew. Sponsors quietly distanced themselves, invitations disappeared, committees removed names from websites without announcements. No scandals, just disappearance, the most humiliating kind. Then the calls started, not from my parents, from people who had defended them, apologizing, some awkwardly, some sincerely, most admitting the same thing. I didn't want to believe it. I thanked them and moved on. My parents called that evening. Together, I let it ring. Again and again. Finally, I answered. "We need to talk," my father said immediately. His voice was different now, smaller. "This has gone too far." I exhaled slowly. "This is exactly as far as it goes," I replied. My mother started crying. Not performative this time, raw. "We raised you," she said. "How could you do this to us?" I felt something tighten in my chest. Not guilt, grief. "You didn't raise me," I said quietly. "You managed me." Silence. Then my father spoke again. "You're enjoying this," he said bitterly. I shook my head even though he couldn't see it. "No," I replied. "I survived it." He tried one last time. "Do you know what people are saying about us?" I closed my eyes. "Yes," I said. "I grew up hearing it about me." That ended the conversation. They didn't call back. That night, the final piece fell into place. A third party, independent, respected, neutral, confirmed what I had documented, publicly, carefully, without drama, just confirmation. And with that, the story stopped being mine. It became history. By morning, the narrative was sealed, not by outrage, by consensus. My parents didn't issue another statement. They didn't defend themselves. They vanished from the public eye, and people noticed. I sat alone at my desk watching the sunrise. My phone buzzed nonstop, but I ignored it, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was done. I thought I'd feel victorious. I didn't. I felt clear, like something heavy had finally been set down. Later that day, I posted one final message. Not accusatory, not triumphant, just this. I told the truth because silence was costing me my sense of self. I don't need revenge. I needed freedom. The response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories, their own fears, their own realizations. The ripple had become a wave. That evening, I walked outside without looking over my shoulder. No tight chest, no rehearsed explanations. Just air. Just quiet. My parents had lost everything they cared about most about. Not because I attacked them, but because the truth made it impossible for them to keep pretending. And in the end, that was their doing, not mine. As I stood there, phone in hand, I realized something profound. I didn't ruin them. I stopped saving them. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The first thing I learned about telling the truth is this. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, then waits for the lie to collapse under its own weight. I woke up the next morning to a stillness that felt unreal. No messages, no calls. For the first time since the anniversary, no one was trying to manage me. That silence wasn't peace. It was fear on their side. I sat at my desk and reviewed everything one last time. Every word, every timestamp, every connection. This wasn't a rant. This wasn't revenge. This was a record. I stripped emotion out of the opening entirely. No accusations, no dramatic language, just facts laid out in chronological order with context and restraint. Because people expect anger from someone who's been hurt. What they don't expect is calm. Before publishing anything, I did something deliberate. I emailed my parents. One sentence. "I'm sharing my story today. You don't need to respond." No threats, no explanation, just notice. The reply came within 2 minutes from my father. "You're making a terrible mistake." I didn't respond because mistakes are impulsive. This was intentional. I uploaded the first video privately, not public, not scheduled, private. Then I sent the link to 5 people, Only 5. People with credibility. People who had watched my parents operate for years. People who had nothing to gain from defending me and nothing to lose from telling the truth. Then I waited. The first response came from a family friend I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. "I watched the whole thing," she wrote. "I'm shaking. You were careful, you were fair, and you were honest." The second response was shorter. "They're done." By the third message, my chest tightened, not with fear, but with something heavier. Validation. Not the social media kind, the quiet, devastating kind that comes when other people confirm what you were told to doubt your entire life. I made the video public at noon. No dramatic title, no exaggerated thumbnail, just the truth. Within minutes, the comments started, slowly at first, then faster. People weren't shocked, they were recognizing. "This explains so much. I always felt something was off. Thank you for saying what everyone was too afraid to say." The narrative shifted faster than I expected, because my parents' image wasn't built on love, it was built on silence, and silence is fragile. By 2 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Take it down," my father said without greeting. His voice was tight, controlled, desperate. "No," I replied calmly. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped. "People are calling, asking questions." "I understand perfectly," I said. "That's what truth does." My mother got on the line. Her voice cracked immediately. "You're destroying us," she sobbed. "Why are you doing this?" I closed my eyes briefly. "I didn't destroy anything. I described it." Silence. Then the line went dead. By evening, the story had spread beyond my channel, not sensationally, organically. People shared it quietly, carefully, with context. The kind of sharing that doesn't fade in 24 hours, the kind that sticks. I watched as comments appeared from people I didn't know, former colleagues of my parents, distant acquaintances, even neighbors. Some supportive, some stunned, some saying nothing at all, but watching. That's when I understood something important. When the truth comes out, the guilty don't always fight it. Sometimes they disappear. My parents' social media went silent that night. No posts, no replies, no carefully worded statements, just absence. And absence spoke louder than denial ever could. Around midnight, I received an email from a lawyer. Not threatening, curious, measured. They wanted to understand the situation. I smiled, because legal curiosity means panic wrapped in professionalism. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I posted a short update. Not emotional, not defensive, just this. "I'm sharing my story to reclaim my voice. I won't be debating it." The response was immediate. Support flooded in, and with it came something else. More messages, more confirmations, more stories from people who had crossed paths with my parents and walked away uneasy. I sat back, heart steady. This wasn't chaos. This was exposure doing exactly what it always does, revealing patterns. At 2 a.m., my mother sent a final message. "We can fix this, please." I read it once. Then I turned off my phone. Because the moment you try to fix the truth is the moment everyone sees exactly who you are. I went to bed knowing something irreversible had happened. Not to them, to me. I was no longer the child they could humiliate for applause. I was the narrator, and narrators decide what gets remembered. The next morning, headlines didn't scream. They whispered. Questions surfaced. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. Praise turned cautious. People didn't rush to condemn my parents. They simply stopped defending them, and that was worse. But the real fallout hadn't happened yet, not even close, because what I released first was only the beginning. I hadn't shared the documents. I hadn't shared the confirmations. I hadn't shared the part that connected everything. Yet, I stood at my window watching the city wake up, phone face down on the table. I knew what came next would end any chance of recovery for them. There would be no family meeting after that, no reconciliation narrative, no way back. The final decision wasn't whether to continue, it was how far, and I already knew the answer, because once the truth steps into the light, you don't drag it back into the dark. The next release would turn discomfort into devastation. There's a strange myth about confrontation. People think it ends with victory or regret, with applause or collapse, with someone standing tall over someone else. The truth is quieter. After everything falls apart, what remains is you. And that's where the real reckoning begins. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded, the comments slowed, the messages thinned, the world moved on, as it always does. My parents stayed gone. No public appearances, no attempts at rebranding, no carefully staged redemption arc. Just absence. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what had happened, not as a headline, not as a story, but as a reality. I had told the truth, and there was no undoing that. People often ask me now if I regret it. They expect hesitation, complexity, some dramatic confession about the cost. The answer is simple. I regret waiting. I regret the years I spent shrinking myself so others could stay comfortable. I regret the silence I mistook for peace. I regret protecting people who were never protecting me. But telling the truth? That saved me. I didn't win a family war. I lost an illusion. And that loss was necessary. Because what I had wasn't love, it was loyalty demanded at the expense of my dignity. And dignity, once lost, is far harder to recover than relationships built on lies. There were moments, quiet ones, where grief surfaced unexpectedly. At the grocery store, at red lights, while folding laundry. Grief for the parents I thought I had. Grief for the version of myself who kept trying. Grief for a future that would never exist. I let myself feel it. Because healing isn't pretending something didn't matter. It's admitting it did and choosing yourself anyway. One evening I received a letter, handwritten, from my mother. No accusations, no explanations, just a single sentence written shakily across the page. I don't know who we are without the story we told. I folded the letter carefully and put it away, because for the first time, that wasn't my problem to solve. What people don't talk about enough is what happens after you expose the truth. The world expects you to keep performing pain, to stay angry, to keep explaining. I didn't. I chose something radical. I chose to live. I stopped measuring my worth by how believable my story sounded. I stopped over-explaining my boundaries. I stopped feeling responsible for other people's discomfort. And in that space, something unexpected happened. Peace. Not the fragile kind, the grounded kind. My channel changed too, not in content, but in tone. I spoke less about betrayal and more about rebuilding, about recognizing manipulation early, about the courage it takes to disappoint people who benefit from your obedience. The comments reflected it. People weren't looking for drama anymore. They were looking for language. Language for what they'd lived through but never named. One message stays with me. A teenager wrote, "My parents make jokes about me in front of relatives. I thought I was weak for being hurt. Now I know I'm not crazy." I cried when I read that. Not because of what I lost, but because of what I protected. That's the moral no one tells you. telling the truth isn't about destroying others, it's about ending cycles. My parents taught me many things unintentionally. They taught me how power hides behind charm, how cruelty disguises itself as humor, how silence can be trained. But they also taught me this: what happens when someone finally refuses to carry shame that isn't theirs? I don't know what my parents tell people now. I don't need to, because once you stop participating in a lie, it collapses on its own. Lies require cooperation. Truth does not. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been humiliated and told you were too sensitive, if you've ever been used to protect someone else's image, if you've ever felt guilty for wanting dignity, hear this. You are not disloyal for telling the truth. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not broken for walking away. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't forgiveness. It's clarity. And clarity doesn't ask for permission. I didn't ruin my parents. I removed myself from their illusion, and when I did, it crumbled. Today, my life is quieter, healthier, honest. I don't perform strength anymore. I live it. And if there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your shame. And you don't owe anyone the version of yourself they can control. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me. And if this story resonated with you, if it mirrored something you've lived through, know this: you are not alone, and you are not wrong for wanting the truth.